Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Viva Connections and SharePoint Framework bi-weekly sync. Today is November 3rd, and my name is Derek Cash-Peterson. I am your host for today's call. We have a packed agenda, so we're going to just jump right into it. We're going to get the latest updates on the SharePoint framework. We're going to have some updates on some various activities from the Patterns and Practices team, PnP.js CLI for M365, and the reusable PnP SPFX controls. We are going to talk about some updated or new samples that we've got, and then as always, picture time with Together mode. And really why most folks are here is the demos from Julie and Paolo to see some real world things that they've been working on. So if you are interested in getting involved in the community here, there's lots of different ways you can do that. You can do that by sharing a demo that you've done on one of these calls. It could be something you've done for your company, as long as it's redacted and you have permission. It could be something you worked on as a side project or something. You can share that. You can also contribute a sample. You can contribute to any of the issues lists on GitHub. You can also provide feedback. How are we doing on these calls? We love to hear things that we could do better. We also want to hear what we're doing right. Do you want to change the documentation? Did you find an update there? You can do all of that. And if you are interested in scheduling a demo for one of these calls, you can use the URL at the bottom, aka.ms/M365PnP. We also have a whole host of resources for folks. If you're looking to get started or looking for some more information on any of the things that you're hearing about today, we've got the M365 developers videos, the community videos, we've got open source repositories, we've got our sample galleries for Teams, SPFX, ACES, Power Platform, list formatting, scripts. But you don't need to remember all of these URLs. You just need to remember one, and that's aka.ms/M365/community. And that'll bring you to the community page with links to all of this lovely, lovely information. And in addition to this call, every 2 weeks, we have a host of other calls as well for the M365 platform call, the adaptive cards, identity, office add-ins, and Power Platform. These are all the links to all of the different invites, but if you want to just go and download the ones that you want to get to, you can use the URL at the bottom, aka.ms/M365/calls. And speaking of calls, we have the next M365 platform call coming up on November 8th at 8 a.m. Pacific time. And we've got great presentations from Bert, Gary, and Hugo. And if you're interested, download that event. This is really your opportunity to hear from them on exactly what's going on Power Pages or workflows or the SharePoint online throttling from Bert. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David for an update on Sharing is Caring.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Derek. Well, friends, as you saw, there is a ton of resources available to you, samples, projects that you can contribute to, all kinds of stuff. And so we want you to feel empowered to be part of that. This is your community, and you are welcome to submit samples and get involved, but you may feel like, I'm not quite sure how to do some of that. Well, Sharing is Caring is a program here that's going to provide you hands-on guidance. What does that mean? That means that we're going to join together in calls, safe space opportunities that aren't recorded at all. So feel free to ask any and all questions that you'd like. And you're going to collaborate with other members of the community, MVPs, members of Microsoft, and we're going to walk through how to do a number of these things together. For example, how to submit a pull request, or how to use all those SPFX samples that Derek was talking about. Absolutely free, safe space. We're scheduling more and more sessions. We have some available now. We're adding more any day now as well. So check them out at aka.ms/sharing is caring. Then, once you do contribute, we want to recognize and celebrate all the amazing things that you're doing in the community. And we're doing that with our recognition program, which is powered by Credly. Yes, you say, Credly, that sounds familiar to me. That same Credly that provides you those badges that you get when you are certified. These are exactly the same. They sit right alongside those, so you can show your clients and your managers that you're effectively making an official difference in the community. Again, no cost at all. We cover that. We do need you to opt in, aka.ms/M365PnP-recognition. And a special congratulations to all those that participated in the Hacktoberfest. Those badges, some have gone out. Some are still being compiled through all of the submissions and contributions, so be on the lookout for your email in the next few days if you haven't received yours yet. Derek, back to you.
All right. And now we're going to turn it over to Vesa for an update on the SharePoint framework.
Excellent. So quick updates in here. First of all, the SharePoint Framework 1.16 release candidate went out. Was it yesterday? I guess it was yesterday. Yes, it was yesterday. Time flies when you're having fun. So we released the release candidate yesterday. We didn't do a significant update on the blog post. It's basically a revamp of the previous announcement, but the features and capabilities are the same which we've been sharing already publicly. The main focus here is enabling the SharePoint Framework solutions to be available in SharePoint Teams, which is fully GA'd, and then in Outlook and Office.com, which is nowadays called Microsoft 365 app. Now, on the Outlook and Office Microsoft 365 app, just to call them out, those experiences are only available in the preview tenant, so in a targeted release mode. So they're not considered as a GA yet, but that's coming first half of next calendar year, whenever those applications are ready to host Microsoft Teams applications. Now, let's go to the following slide. Quick recap on the timelines and versions which are available. So 1.15.2 is currently still the latest version in production. 1.16 GA will happen in mid-November. So we're talking about days rather than weeks or months right now. So that's coming up relatively soon. And in there, as said, the key point being the SPFX solutions with the Teams JavaScript SDK V2 support, and that enables then those solutions to be across multiple other applications. And you can access, for example, Outlook APIs through that endpoint and that typing. Now, you can, of course, build SPFX solutions in Teams, SharePoint, Viva ACEs, and all of that is available in a GA mode across the stack. 1.17 ETA is the first quarter of 2023, and SPFX V2 in quotes. Let's see if we can get the name change finally completed at that time. Will happen later next year. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in the roadmap. But that's it for SPFX side. Let's move, I think, PnP.js side.
Take it away, Julie.
It is. So we have a new version, as we do every month, going to be released November 11th. This, as always, has our general documentation updates. We have a bug fix for the iFolder and Git item error where it was returning the parent folder, not the list item. So that bug has been fixed. We have a bug fix for paged behavior in list items. There was a fix for rendered list data as stream was not working in batches. That has been fixed. We added the ability to get the content from the versions of a file. So if you go and retrieve the version of an item, then you can get the content for that. So that's helpful. And that means that we also improved the typings for iVersion info. And then we added the ability to invoke the search and suggest endpoints for SharePoint, and then updated the corresponding documentation. There's actually been a couple other bug fixes since then, so check out all the issues that were closed in the pull requests if you want to see what's going on there. And as well, you can test out any of these above fixes with our nightly build. So if you install the @PnP/SP @V3 Nightly or graph @V3 Nightly, etc., you can test out any of the fixes that have been merged to this date. And as always, follow us on M365 PnP.js on Twitter to see all of our updates when they happen. Back to you, Derek.
All right, thanks, Julie. And now we're going to hand it over to Gary for an update on the CLI for Microsoft 365.
Thanks, Derek. Right, okay, so it's like what Julie's just said, it's a new month and we've got a new release. I'm just going to start with this slide does not really give justice to the amount of activity that we've seen this month. It's been Hacktoberfest and it's been amazing. We have had over 30 PRs submitted. We've had lots of new contributors, which I'm delighted to say we've hit a milestone. We now have 100 contributors on the repository, which has just been fantastic. Lots of new people getting involved as well. I want to highlight one individual, Nico Declare, who basically has got involved in the last couple of weeks and submitted 9 PRs, which is amazing. So thank you very much for the contributions and just across the whole community, everyone getting involved and really kind of pushing all the updates during Hacktoberfest. So we've got lots of new commands, so we've got lots of Power Platform commands. There's still more issues that are available. So if you're interested in continuing contributing past Hacktoberfest, there's still tons of issues that you can pick up. But we've got support for cards, environments, gateways, tables, solutions, and tenant settings. We've got some more commands for SharePoint Online, managing event receivers, lots and lots of commands around permissions as well. So breaking inheritance, role definitions, role assignments. There's a great coverage in there now, and we've also got a few more commands for to do. That doesn't even scratch the surface, because I encourage you to check out the release notes, which I've just put a load of links in the chat. There's a whole host of updates and enhancements to existing commands as well. So I really highly recommend that you check that out, see if there's any commands that you're using at the moment that you've got new capabilities that you can use. So to get the new version of CLI for Microsoft 365, you can get that from npm using the @latest tag, or if you want to just try it out, best place to do that is using our Docker container. Use the latest tag on there and you'll get the 5.9 version. We've got a few things coming up. So we have our 5th birthday party that's taking place in a couple of weeks on a Thursday morning. We'd highly encourage you to join. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of a presentation from Waldeck. We're going to have a quiz. We're going to potentially have some prizes as well that you can win. Please take a look at the link in the chat. I've put a link in there to the party invite. Please register interest so that we know that you're going to come along. That would be great. And for this month as well, we're planning to release version 6 as well. So great that we've done 5 years. We're already on to version 6. If you're not already following us for the latest updates, please check out the Twitter handle @CLI Microsoft 365. Check out the repository, and please, if you're on Discord, join the Discord server and join in the conversation. And again, just want to say thank you to everyone who's contributed this month. It's been absolutely fantastic to see. Back to you, Derek.
All right, thanks, Gary. Yeah, that's lots of great stuff. Now we're going to hand it over to Alex for SPFX reusable components.
Thank you, Derek. I would love to say, as Julie and Gary, that, hey, it's a new month and new version, but no, we are still on 3.11 and 3.10. So no huge updates here. There are some plans to review PRs, fix some bugs on the next few weeks. So hopefully we will have some new releases in a couple of weeks. So that's all from my side.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Alex. And Modern Search. The 4.8 beta was out in, well, it should have been the September 22 release, but I guess we're going to make it the November release. And a special thanks to a bunch of folks who submitted some PRs for support for actionable adaptive cards like Viva Aces, and keep track of all the release notes for the updates that came through. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David for PnP SPFX samples.
Awesome. Again, thank you, Derek. So, friends, we have a plethora of samples within SPFX extensions, web parts, and ACEs. We're getting all those PRs. We just want to mention that we know that we're a little behind on that. We really appreciate all of your patience and the amazing samples that you've been contributing. We're bringing in reinforcements to get those processed. It's been a busy couple of months for us, but don't lose sight of those PRs getting accepted. We can't wait to get them accepted and hand you over those badges. So just want to say thank you. Keep up the great work, and we're looking to see even more amazing stuff coming from you. Derek, back to you.
Okay, and it's picture time. Optional picture time. Bessa?
Yeah, absolutely. I will share my screen. We'll do that. And we'll wait a few more seconds for people to join. So we'll get the full room. We do have, again, 180 or so live attendees. Let's see how many people will get to the screen as well. Few more seconds. Let's wait a while. We still have room in the room. Does that make sense? It makes sense. There's room in the room. So room. I guess that's filling in the 50. I will put the recording on. Let's do some hand waving. We'll grab a GIF animation out of that and share that in LinkedIn and in Twitter and in social media. Thank you, everybody, once again joining on the community call. Hopefully you can make the Las Vegas or Copenhagen later this year so we can meet in person as well, but we'll be in this community calls as well. Thank you, everybody. Great to see you here. Thank you. Thank you. We'll grab a GIF animation out of that. And then let's go to the actual stars of the day. Right, Derek?
Yep. Okay. So it is time for Julie.
All right. So what we have today is a PnP.js version 3 sample solution. And so what I decided to do, we do have a, Patrick and I did do videos on this sample, and this sample is available in the dev SPFX sample repo, so you can go and check it out. I did update it a tiny bit for today's call to just do highlight some other things. And so this is a demo you can in general see, but we'll go through it a little bit more detail. Okay, so this is the sample that I'm going to show you the code for. Essentially what it does is it looks into the document library and it gets all the documents in the document library and returns the size and the name and the title of the document. And then I have a button here that updates the titles. And what it essentially does is just appends the word -updated to each name, which is super useful, right? We all want to be able to do that. So if we click update item titles, it'll go out and do that update and then update the UI so that it shows that the name of the file was updated. And if we go in the document library, it'll show that. The other thing that you see here is this extra new thing that says, my name is Julie Turner, and we're going to talk about where that came from and why in just a second. So that's what we're going to look at the code for. So let's start and switch over to the code. And so here's our solution. And I'm starting by looking at the package.json. So when you want to use PnP.js, you need to install those dependencies. And if you go to our documentation and look at the getting started documentation, it'll show you how to do that specifically. But I wanted to just point out that for this project, I've included the SP package, which is all the SP SharePoint REST endpoint support. And then I also included the graph one, and this is our support for graph calls, and this is not in the sample that you'll find on the repository. That's why that's sort of new for today. And we also added the logging package. In V2, the logging package was embedded in the SharePoint package and the graph package, but we've separated it out for V3, so that's a separate install now. Okay, so we have our packages installed and it's all running, so we know everything is good to go. So now we're going to talk about this config file. So there's essentially two ways to that we recommend that you use PnP.js in your solution. By one, either creating a sort of a config file or a container for all of your PnP.js calls, or that you create a service. I'm not going to demo a service today. I will say that a service is how I do all of my coding, but that doesn't necessarily work for everything. So and for everybody and their patterns of development. So that's just my preferred way. But here's one where we're going to use a config file. And so what a config file essentially is it a way for us to consolidate all our imports that we're going to use in one place. And so what that means is that for each of our libraries, our SP library and our graph library, we have packages of functionality, and we blocked them into different imports so that you could just import the bits of functionality that you need for your project, thereby keeping the amount of code that you're bundling in as small as possible. So I've included all the stuff that I need for the SharePoint REST calls that solution did. So we need these baseline SharePoint ones. We are going to use logging, so our logging package is imported. And then we imported webs, lists, items, and batching, because I'm going to show you batching. And then in addition to that, as I said, I included graph. So one of the things I want to point out right now is that if we were just using SharePoint and not using the graph, then this import right here where it says SPFX could just be that. We wouldn't need this additional part here. This additional part where it says as SPFX is sort of a renaming. So in the PnP SP package, there is a method for SPFX that creates the behaviors that we need. We're going to give it a different label because there is an identically named one in our graph package for instantiating graph context. And so I'm going to rename that one to graph SPFX because I'm going to use both libraries. So now I'm creating globals for our SharePoint factory interface and our graph factory interface. And then I'm creating two methods here that I'm going to export. So I'm exporting a constant that is getSP. It needs the context, that's the web part context passed into it. And then assuming that the context isn't null, it's just going to create the SharePoint factory interface that we need. So we could then call SPFI. We say we're going to use the behavior, the SharePoint SPFX behavior, which establishes our context. So we pass the context to it. And just to illustrate how you can add and chain additional behaviors, we're going to add dot using, and then we're going to pass in PnP logging because we imported that and set our level, a level for when we want logging to occur. So this is how you chain behaviors together. And if you look at our documentation, you can see a bunch of different behaviors that we provide. And of course, you could build your own. So that then sets up this SP object, which is a global. So then we have an identical method for getting the graph context. And again, it's the factory interface. We're using our graph SPFX to create the context for graph. And I'm using logging on that one too. It's the exact same thing. Okay, so let's just ignore that for a second and move over. This is our root TS file for our web part. And in that, in our on init method that we are adding in, because it's not there by default, we're going to add an asynchronous method for on init. And in that, we're going to make a call to our getSP and our getGraph methods passing in the context. And so you can see I'm importing those two methods that I exported from my PnP.js config file in so that I can make the call and pass in the context. That establishes, similar to how it was set up in V2, that establishes our global context for the SP factory interface and the graph factory interface. Okay, that's the big change from version 2 to version 3 is that those objects are not global anymore. So we need to sort of create our own global versions of them. Okay, now that that's done, we can just jump right into our root component. So this is our root component that we that does all the work. This is maybe not how I would do it in production, and I want to kind of make that point that this example is purely meant as an example. This is not production level code. So don't use it, don't look at it and go, oh, this is exactly the way I should do it in production. It's not meant to be that. So when we get in here, we have some imports because we're importing from our config file and some other things that we need so that the typing's resolved. But essentially, I have a state object for my React component. And right here in the constructor, I've created a couple private variables for that SP and graph object because I'm going to use them. I've established them as global objects, but I want to use them and I want to get an instance of them. So I'm going to establish a local copy of that graph and SP object by calling getSP and getGraph with no context. So that'll just return the object I've already defined. Then in the component.did mount here, as soon as the component's mounted, we're going to make a call to read all file sizes. And that's not an asynchronous component. So read all file, I'm not awaiting it. I'm just making the call to it. And so if we skip down through the render to our read all file sizes, this is going to be our first example of how we're going to add another behavior to this because we want to use caching. So what we do to do that is we have this SP factory method. And if we pass an existing factory interface into it, what that will do is copy all the behaviors that are already exist on the SP factory and the this._SP factory interface to the new one we're creating, which will include our context, which means that we have all authentication stuff that we need to use it, as well as the logging that we had added in that original one. So then we're going to say dot using and add caching to it where we're doing a session store. So now we have a new SharePoint factory interface that has caching in it. And so now we can use that to make a call to the list that is where I defined a constant called library name. It's just our document library. I'm going to get the items. I'm going to select just the fields that I need. And because file is one of those expandable fields, I'm going to tell it to expand the file /length. You actually don't need that. That could be just file there. Anyway, once I make that call, then I have that response, and I'm going to just quickly clean that up. So I have all those items, and I want to make a new object that is a little bit more clean, where if there's no title, I'm going to say it's unknown. If the file length doesn't exist, I'm going to set it to 0. Just some cleanup on those items. And then this is the added thing here. I added a new method here. Again, this is not how you would do this in production. I added a new method here where I'm going to load a user. And this is where I wanted to just demo quickly that I can make graph calls here as well. So this load user method, which is asynchronous, is going to just go get the me object from graph. So that's who's the current user and what is their information from the graph. And then I return that back to this user object. And then I set the state for the items that I retrieved up here and the user that I retrieved from the graph. And so that's how I can then update the user interface to have my display name or any other piece of information from the graph about me. Then the other thing that I want to show, let's minimize this up, is go back up to our render method and just show that here's where I'm rendering that display name, but it could be, you know, any of the other properties about me, including about me, and we could render whatever that is in there. And this is where I'm rendering then the items. Now I have that button, if you recall, where I was going to update the titles. So let me come down here and just look at what update titles does. So in update titles, if you think about it, we have a whole bunch of elements, items that we retrieve from the document library. And it's not really efficient for us to just call one after another, make multiple REST calls one after another to update each of those items. So in this case, we're going to create a batched instance. So now I'm going to take the SP object. Again, the behavior on this right now, the behaviors that exist on this object are the context for security and logging. So now I'm going to say, okay, this.sp, and then one of our root methods on that is batched. And what that returns is what's called a tuple. And a tuple is an array here with two properties in it, one of which, the batched SP, is an instance of the SharePoint factory interface, but which with all the extra needed plumbing to do batch requests. And then a second thing is a method called execute. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to just go clone our state variable with items in it, because we never work on the state variable directly when we're doing work like this. So I'm using a little shortcut here to clone that. And then I'm going to loop through each one of the items and make a call, but I'm going to use the batched SP as the call. So we'll do batched SP web list, get by title, items, get by ID, because I have the ID, and then I'm going to make the update call where I'm going to set the title to the current name plus the dash updated. And then after that, I'm going to put the result of that onto my res array. So this is an array of the updated item results, and I'm going to push each of the results onto that so that they're available after. And then I'm going to await the execute method. And so when I await the execute method, that launches all that batch request that I created, which will do all of these updates all in one grouped update. After that, I then remember that I added the results to this item update result array. So that means this result has each of the list items in it. So if I then loop through the results and do the result.item, this gives me a queryable instance of the item. And so the reason we're doing that is, remember that when I got the items from the list originally, I used caching. And so if I made that call again, because it's the same endpoint, it wouldn't know that it wouldn't go get a new version because it's cached. So we'd have to clear the cache, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm just showing you here is that we can use this item result, since the batched entry didn't have the caching on it, then this item is it is not batched, but it can be used to go and fetch the item and ID and title from the item so that I can update our items with the new title. And then I can set state, setting the new updated items because I cloned them. So I'm going to set them back to state, and then that will update my user interface. So that is an example of using PnP.js version 3 in the 20 minutes I was allotted. So there we go. And that is all I have. And I will try to answer questions in the chat unless Vesa wants to drop questions on me like he kind of always does.
No, this was good. Now, before Derek actually moves forward, there was a question from Johanna, because we do have time. You didn't take all of the 20 minutes.
Yes,
see?
yes. I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so this is great for PnP.js snippets, but going on what Julie said, are there samples available where people can see the production code to make sure that we're structured stuff correctly? So you called out something in here which was about the graph, or something which is not about the production. But
no, it's just more, yeah, it's just more the structure of the whole entire solution. I would not, first of all, I would never build components, and I don't think, even if you're doing React hooks, I wouldn't put your PnP.js code in the UX. I really like to do segregation of concern. So any of the React components, or anywhere you're doing a render of the user interface, I don't think it's appropriate to be making calls to the user interface. I like to separate my business logic out from the UI. So the components, the React components, should only be doing things that have to do with displaying information and or reacting to user input. And all the business logic should really be put into a separate place. So when I say don't use this as like production code, what I more mean around that is the structure of the code. Like, I just wouldn't put a lot of this logic about reading files and loading the user and updating the titles in the same component file where I'm rendering the UI. That was more what I meant by that. And then the other part about the loading user, I probably would do that. I did it in line with reading the file sizes. I'd probably do both calls at the same time and load them into separate variables. So I wouldn't be, I'm essentially forcing a serial path through this. That's why I was sort of saying I wouldn't do this in production. I wouldn't do a bunch of asynchronous calls and then do the asynchronous call to the loading the user, because they don't depend on each other. So there's no sense in waiting for one to finish to do the other, especially when you're writing asynchronous code. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's more what I meant about it not being production code. Does that answer the question better? Makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense. And then we might need to follow up, Julie, on how about if we would actually have a session related on, okay, this is how Julie would write production code, because there's a lot of people who would be interested in doing that. So
sure. Those are trade secrets, though.
Good. Anyway, thank you for that one, Julie. Derek, welcome. Sorry for jumping in.
No worries. And now we're going to turn it over to Paolo Pialorsi to show us a demo on building an ISV offering for Microsoft Viva with ACES.
Yes, thank you, Derek, and thank you, Julie. Great demo. Now we are going to talk about how we should create with the SharePoint framework an ACE solution, or generally speaking, a SharePoint framework solution for ISV, willing to offer that solution as a kind of a software as a service offering, hosting their backend code on Azure and having the proper settings in place to make it happen for a multi-tenant solution. So First of all, let me try to set the context. Let's assume that you are an ISV and you want to build a solution. And you want to build a solution which might be an extension of Viva Connection, so an adaptive card extension built with SharePoint Framework. But what I'm going to talk about applies completely also to a SharePoint Framework web part. So just to be clear. And let's say that you want to sell or provide your solution as a software as a service model. You should keep into account that you will have to do some activities to register an application in Azure Active Directory. You will need to do proper hosting on Azure and stuff like that. So practically speaking, there are some architectural challenges that you need to face when you want to do that. First of all, you need, or you should at least create a multi-tenant application and register a multi-tenant application in Azure Active Directory. I say you should because the other option would be to manually register and create an application on every single tenant of every customer, which means you're not offering a software as a service solution because you would have to do setup stuff on every single customer tenant, which is indeed not doable. So you will have to create a multi-tenant solution, and you will have to make your multi-tenant solution available on all of your customers' tenants, and your backend services will need to be multi-tenant aware in order to being able to do that. Plus the fact that your application most likely will need to do something with the target tenants of your customers, like accessing data in SharePoint Online or using Microsoft Graph and other stuff like that. And as such, your customers will need to grant permissions to your applications to do stuff on their own tenant. So there are some requirements from a deployment point of view which need to be satisfied. And that's why we are covering this topic in this demo. Just to give you an idea, let's imagine that you are an ISV again, and you have your own tenant. You registered your application in your own tenant as a multi-tenant application, and then we will see, practically speaking, how and where you can do that. And that you also configure your application in order to have proper permissions to access Microsoft Graph. Then you want to host, for example, on Azure and in an Azure Function app, your backend infrastructure so that your SharePoint Framework solution will rely on this backend infrastructure hosted on a Function app. And you configured your application in Azure AD with a client secret and a client ID in order to being able to get a token to consume target resources in the target tenant. But now the point is that the target tenant is not just one tenant. The target tenant will be any tenant of any of your customers who will get your solution, meaning that there will be the need to register your multi-tenant application in the target tenants. The customer will have to grant the permissions to those applications. And when it's done, any of the customer who will have the application registered and the permission granted will be able, in your custom code, which will be running in SharePoint or in Viva Connections or wherever else you like, as long as you can run SharePoint Framework code, will be able to make a request to your backend infrastructure, providing an access token which will be issued by the Azure Active Directory of your specific customer tenant. And on your backend infrastructure, you will have to validate the token, and you will be able to get access to the backend infrastructure of the customer, so of their SharePoint, of their Microsoft 365 workloads, generally speaking, thanks to the grant of the permissions that the admin in the customer side did for your application. All of these activities require quite some work potentially. And that's why, and thanks God, that SharePoint Framework, starting from version 1.15 point something, helps you a lot in doing that. In fact, starting from this version of SharePoint Framework, there are some useful attributes that you can configure in the package solution.json file, which allow us to have an easy deployment of this kind of solutions. So let me switch to the demo and let me show you how it works in action. So first of all, I want to show you the actual result. This is a demo that we have already seen something like 1 year ago, and which I recently updated in order to have support for these new functionalities that I'm talking about. This is an adaptive card extension. Actually, there are two ACEs which allow to manage a fake list of orders that you can show, and you can insert additional orders using this ACE into this list of orders. This is an example that you can find also under the sample solution gallery right here. And I think I posted on the chat the link, and if not, I will do it right after this demo. But here you can find an easy access to the source code. You can either download it or view it, and you can see how the solution is built. Now, let me switch to the actual code base. And first of all, we have in the back end of this adaptive card extension an Azure function where we manage the list of orders. This is a really regular orders function, so an Azure function running on Azure where we have actions like get orders to get the whole list of orders. We can get a single order, we can add a new order and stuff like that. Nothing really special. And under the cover, we work with an in-memory structure for orders just for the sake of having a simple deployment without the need to deploy databases and other stuff, and to let you experiment with this sample without the need to deploy a complex scenario. This Azure function is backed by an application which I registered in Azure Active Directory, and let's assume that I am the ISV selling the solution. Here is in my tenant, in my ISV tenant, let me go here, the application registered in Azure Active Directory. This is an application that I registered simply going to Azure Active Directory and going to app registrations and creating a new app registration. So let me search for it again and let me show you how it is configured. I have a client ID as I have for any other application. In the authentication section, I configured my application to authenticate any Azure AD directory. So it is configured for multi-tenancy. I also configured the web platform in order to have a bunch of redirect URLs configured in my application. Plus, and eventually in the certificates and secret, you can configure an X5 certificate, an X509 certificate, or a client secret to associate it to your application if needed. In the API permissions, you can configure your graph or SharePoint permissions. Here, for example, I configure just the user.read permission to keep it really basic and simple. But it can be any set of permission scopes that you like. And then this is the application which is actually used under the cover of my API. And so I'm exposing an API through this application. And that's why I configured a unique URI for my application, which generally speaking should be something readable and understandable. That's why for me it is API PnP.contoso.orders, so a readable name, not just a auto-generated GUID as the predefined value that you get from Azure. And then I configured a couple of permissions, one to read the orders and one to have the full control on the orders. So this is the definition in my ISV tenant, again, assuming that I am the ISV right now, in my ISV tenant of my multi-tenant application in Azure Active Directory. Now, I'm willing to use this application as the entry point for the consumer app, which will be the SharePoint Framework Adaptive Card Extensions. But before moving there, let me switch back a little bit more on the Azure function just to highlight that, as you can see here, for example, in order to add a new order, I have an attribute which is called the function authorize. This is a custom attribute, and you can find the implementation in the sample on GitHub, which will simply declare that in order to be able to call this add order endpoint of my function, I will need to have the orders.full-control permission in the access token that I will get. Meaning I'm doing authorization control. So as I need the orders full control to add a new order, I simply need the orders.read, or eventually still fine to have the orders full control to get an order. So to read, I simply need the basic permission. To write, I need an additional or advanced permission. And this kind of authorization check can be done and should be done on the Azure function side. At the same time, in the Azure function, because we have configured the application Azure AD to support multiple tenants, we need to be aware of the tenants that we want to support. So if we are offering or selling our solution as a software as a service solution, we should, in the token validation parameters of our function, we should validate the issuer of the token, meaning the Azure Active Directory tenant, which will issue the access token that will be used to consume our function, our backend. Why? Because as I showed you in the previous diagram, we can have multiple tenants, and each and every tenant will have its own Azure Active Directory, which will be the issuer of the tokens. So in our business logic, we need to validate if the issuer is a tenant of a customer that is basically paying for the service or not. And if not, we will simply say, sorry, you will not get access to my environment. This is a demo one, so I will simply accept any one. But in your real life, you should do proper validation and store eventually a list of allowed or registered or paying customer tenants in a SQL database or in a Cosmos DB or wherever you like. So this is the Azure function. Now, we want to consume this Azure function from SPFX and from our adaptive card extensions. Let me switch to the SPFX solution. This is the adaptive card extension that we were having a look before. This is the managed orders. I will not dig into the implementation details of the ACEs by themselves, because this is not a session about how to implement ACEs. This is a session about how to manage the multi-tenant deployment. But just for the sake of clarity, here in my adaptive card extension, I have in the onInit method, once again, the creation of the AAD client instance through the AAD client factory. And as you can see here, I'm getting a client for this specific URI, which is precisely the one we used to uniquely identify our API in the backend. So through this method call, we get back an AAD HTTP client object, which will be simply provided to a service that we have in our solution, which will be the order service, where we will rely on it to make the actual requests to get, read, update, add, and so on and so forth, the orders through the back-end API. Now, what is interesting from the SharePoint framework point of view is that in the package solution.json file of my solution, right now, I declare that from a web API permission requests point of view, I need for my solution to be fully functional to have access to the resource called pnp.contoso.orders, which is the name of the application that I registered in my tenant, so in the ISV tenant. And I want to have, for example, the permission scope orders.fullcontrol, which is again one of the permissions that I configure in the expose an API section of my Azure AD application. This is what we have been doing for a while now with SharePoint Framework, and by doing that, we can build a package and we can deploy the package in a target tenant. And let me show you how it works when we do such a thing. So let me switch to a demo tenant that I have. And in this tenant, I'm going to add to the app catalog, the new one, the SPPKG file for my solution, as long as I will be able to find the finder. Okay, here it is. So this is my SPPKG for my solution. And if I will upload this package into my target tenant, you will see that, okay, now we have the SPPKG, and SharePoint Framework is smart enough to say, okay, you need to enable this application if you want on all of the sites, because it is a tenant-wide solution. Yes, please do that. And then it will also say, okay, keep into account that for this solution to work properly, we also need to grant some permissions, which are the permissions for my application. Let me go to the API access page. If I will do that right now, I will be able to see that there is a solution, my Contoso orders one, which is pending approval for the orders.fullcontrol permission for the PnP Contoso orders application. However, if I will click on approve, and I'm going to do that, it will fail. Let me show you. You see, I have this error. Why? Because actually, the application that I, as the ISV, registered in my own ISV tenant is not yet available in the customer tenant. And as such, it will not be possible to grant a permission to an application which does not exist in my tenant. Okay, so what I should do would be to open, for example, a tab, and using the admin consent URL that Azure Active Directory provides us, I will be able to register my application onto my tenant and grant the permissions to my application. This admin consent URL will accept the ID, the unique ID of my application, as well as a redirect URI, which is one of those configured in the authentication section of my Azure AD application. Let's do that. By doing that, okay, I will have to authenticate as a tenant admin. And once I will do that, I will be able to register and grant the permissions on my tenant for that specific application. By doing that, I will be able now to register my application and grant the permissions if I will go back to the admin center and I will refresh this page. Every now and then it takes a while, so there is no guarantee that it will already work right now. But even if it will not work exactly right now, in a matter of few seconds or minutes from now, it will be possible to grant the permissions and to approve the permissions for this application, so that I will be able, actually it is already working, wonderful, so I will be able to use my solution. Now, as you can see, this process is quite complex from an end user point of view. And that's why Microsoft updated the behavior of SharePoint framework and made it possible to do something like that. You can add in the package solution.json file of your solution the app ID and the reply URL of your solution, so that all of the process of doing the registration and the consent of the application will be taken into account by the SharePoint framework infrastructure rather than by your customer, which is really good in my opinion. So let me build another package for my solution with this updated package solution.json file. So it will take just a few seconds, hopefully. And in the meantime, I can drink something. Not beer, it is not yet 6 p.m., so not yet a beer. Okay, so I have my solution ready. So let me switch back to actually another tenant that I have, where I will do the same, but right now I will use my updated package with the new attributes in there. So I upload the packages like as before. As like before, I will have to make it tenant-wide available if I want to do that, enable the app. I will still see the message that we need to grant some permissions to my application. But when I will click to the Go to API access page, now in this tenant, which is a fresh and clean new one, you can notice it by the different color in the top. Just kidding, but yeah, it is a new one, a different one. Now, if I will select the pending permission grant and I will click on the approve button, by clicking right here on the approve button, you will see that we will have a dialog which will prompt the tenant admin to do the admin registration and consent for my application, eventually on behalf of the whole organization. And as such, a tenant admin will be allowed to do the whole process without the need to know what the admin consent URL is and to know all of the steps needed, but actually just following the admin UI of SharePoint framework and SharePoint Online, it will be possible to register the application in the tenant and have it ready and available in the target environment. We see the wonderful page of M365 PnP community. And by going back right here, we will soon see that the application is now registered and available with the proper permissions configured. So it will refresh soon, and let's see. And we are, okay, perfect. So if I will go, for example, to the workbench of my tenant in any site collection of my choice, I can now add the orders ACE, the manage order ACE, and you will see that I will be able to use my orders ACE. I will have a bunch of orders available, and I can play with it in my new target tenant. Oops, let me click on this one. So it is really, really useful and powerful to being able to configure those two settings inside the package solution.json file, rather than having to provide additional documentation and guidance to the customer in order to deploy the solution. One last thing that I want to share with you is that you need to keep into account that for your Azure function to properly work with all of the tenants of your customers, you will also need on the hosting platform, so on Azure, to configure in the cores section that you want to allow access to all of the cores, because actually all of your customers will come from different URLs. The request will come from tenant.sharepoint.com of every different customer that you have. So you can either configure one by one all of the tenants of your customers in the list of cores enabled in this setting, or eventually you can configure an asterisk to make it possible to use any consumer for your API. Up to you. This is really important, fundamental. Otherwise, your API will not work in the backend of SharePoint framework. That said, this is, again, a really useful technique which is provided by Microsoft by SharePoint Framework to automate the registration of a solution and to have an easy and speedy deployment of SharePoint Framework solutions. Just as a reminder, remember to configure properly the reply URL, because it will be the one you will use as the return URL after the consent and the registration. Remember to provide a meaningful name for your unique URI. Remember to configure course, and remember to validate the issuer in the token validation of your Azure function. And that said, I think that's all for me. Back to you, Derek. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Paolo. All right. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Paolo. And thank you for being here today. The recording will be available within 24 hours on the Microsoft 365 community YouTube channel. You can also get to that from aka.ms/m365/videos. Don't forget, follow us on Twitter, Microsoft 365 Dev, and at M365 PnP. And the next Viva Connections and SPFX call will be on November 17th at 7 a.m. Pacific time. The next M365 Power Platform call is November 10th at 7 a.m. Pacific time. And thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.